The Bible is often called the best-selling book in history, and it's considered the foundational text of two of the three major Abrahamic religions. It's also been an important part of Western culture, and has helped shape the literature and the art of many different places and times over the last 2,500 years. Think Paradise Lost, the Sistine Chapel, and the movie Ben-Hur. But where does the Bible actually come from? What does it have to tell us? Does it have any overall themes or messages? And what role has it played in the development of the Western world? These are some of the questions we're going to ask over the course of this series on the development and the significance of the Bible. The word Bible comes from the Greek ta biblia, which means the books. The fact that it's Greek reflects the reality that a great many of the Church's early thinkers belonged to the Greek-speaking Orthodox churches of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. But once the term was adopted in the Catholic West, where nobody spoke Greek, it became a proper name for this specific book, which was often the only book with which people were familiar. After all, before the invention of the printing press, books were expensive to make and hard to come by. And in any case, most people never learned to read and write. When they did, they learned in schools run by the church, and the language they learned to read was not their own, since the languages of Europe had not yet developed their own literature, but Latin, which had become an entirely written language used by intellectuals and members of the clergy. When Johann Gutenberg first perfected printing in the 15th century, it was the Bible that was one of the first books he produced, because he knew that a fancy edition would bring in a lot of money. Given the centrality of the Bible in Western culture, it's not surprising that people have been thinking and writing about it since ancient times. Their answers to the questions we asked a moment ago developed into an established tradition, or rather, a pair of traditions, Jewish and Christian. This division reflects the philosophical, cultural, and intellectual differences between Jews and Christians, but above all, the fact that Christianity was founded upon a series of texts created in its early years which never became a part of the Jewish scripture. Jewish tradition recognizes only the Tanakh, or Hebrew Bible, as it's called because it's almost entirely written in that language, and it claims that the first part of the Tanakh, the Torah, was written by Moses himself at God's direction, at a time which in modern terms would have been around 1200 BCE. The rest of the Bible, the Nevi'im, or prophets, and the Ketuvim, or writings, was, we are told, written by various individuals who lived after Moses. But even though Moses was supposedly the only person to whom God spoke directly, the rest of the Tanakh is also considered divinely inspired in some way. The words of the Hebrew Bible are considered sacred. Even the parchment becomes sacred once the words have been written upon it, and the Jews of ancient times did not believe that any other books were holy enough to deserve being written down at all. But even so, traditions about how to understand the Bible and interpret its content, which Jews call midrash, or explication, did develop. And these were passed down by word of mouth until they were finally written down themselves during the Middle Ages. Christians, on the other hand, tend to focus upon the New Testament, which was written in Greek during the 1st and early 2nd centuries CE. The texts of the New Testament are, on the whole, very different in style and content from those of the Hebrew Bible, or Old Testament as Christians call it. But they believe that both the Old and New Testaments are divinely inspired. They are also, they claim, an inseparable unit whose ideas about God, the world, and the human condition are consistent, even though they were the product of many different people over many hundreds of years, because they were all writing under divine inspiration. More than that, Christians believe that the prophecies recorded in the Old Testament, which are concerned with the issues that were current in Israelite society at the time they were composed, are actually referring to the events at the center of the New Testament, the life and the mission of Jesus of Nazareth. The New Testament itself makes this assumption by quoting verses from several books of the Hebrew Bible, which it says are actually describing Jesus. This makes the Christian story the fulfillment of ancient Hebrew beliefs, and the church the successor and even the replacement of the Jewish people. Traditional Christians, like traditional Jews, believe that the Bible has been handed down without error. But where Jews have created a rich tradition of oral law, as they call it, stands alongside the written law of the Bible, Christians have been more ambivalent about how and when to interpret it. Is, for example, the story of Job a parable like the stories Jesus tells to make some point about how we should behave? Or is it the record of something that actually happened at some time in the distant past? And were there 6 literal days of creation, as we were told in Genesis? Or is this story meant to explain the origins of the world, just as today scientists theorize about the Big Bang? Were Adam and Eve real people, despite modern discoveries about the evolutionary development of Homo sapiens? And what about the descriptions of hell in the New Testament? Are they meant to refer to a physical place, located perhaps under the surface of the earth, just as heaven would have to be somewhere beyond its atmosphere? Modern evangelical Christianity tends to promote biblical literalism, whether as a reaction to modern criticism of the Bible, or as part of the Protestant position that the beliefs of Christians should be based entirely on the text, which they should read for themselves, and not on the proclamations of the Church. So there have always been differences of opinion about how to read the Bible and to decide what it has to say about the world and our place in it. But over the last few centuries, these differences have become even more pointed, as we have learned a great deal more about the world in which the Old and New Testaments were created, their cultures, their beliefs, and their literature, and have paid closer attention to how that literature was written and the principles it followed. As ironic as it may sound, we know more today about the world of 2,000 or 3,000 years ago than people who lived much closer to it, before the development of philology, the study of languages, archaeology, geography, and historical analysis. And in the case of the Hebrew Bible, this knowledge gives us a perspective on its origins that we were lacking before, and it was our only source of information for the era in which it was created. Now that we know something about the broader historical context in which the Bible developed, it makes sense to start with that context, instead of making the Bible our focus and seeing everything else as nothing more than the evidence that corroborates it. So what kind of world produced the Hebrew Bible? Though today it's often described as the sacred text of the Jews, it actually comes from a time before the development of Judaism as we know it, and reflects instead a culture which historians and archaeologists call Israelite, because the people who produced it called themselves Israel, or the children of Israel. Only in the last stages of the Bible do we find the term Yehudi, which originally referred to a member of the Israelite tribe of Yehudah, or Judah, but eventually came to mean something like Jewish in the modern sense. The Hebrew Bible as it exists today seems to have begun as a series of oral traditions from the time of the Israelite kingdoms between the 10th and 6th centuries BCE, which were first combined together and written down on parchment by scribes during and after the Babylonian exile in the middle and later 6th century. Though the Torah is the first part of our Bible, it need not have been the oldest. The historical books that deal with the period before and during the kingdoms would not have been written much later than the events they describe, and the same is true of the prophets who lived and preached in that period. The Torah, on the other hand, describes, among other things, the beginning of the Israelites' ethnic identity under Abraham and their national identity under Moses, events which would have happened hundreds of years in their past and for which neither they nor we have any direct historical evidence. It is now generally believed by scholars that the Israelites were a subgroup of the Canaanites rather than immigrants from afar, and that they were never enslaved in Egypt as we're told in the book of Exodus, but did live in Canaan under Egyptian rule for many years. The last book of the Torah, Deuteronomy, already existed in some form in the 7th century BCE when the Judean king Josiah put its laws into practice. The Torah is first described as an established written text in connection with Ezra the scribe, who in the mid-5th century BCE was one of a group of Jews returning from Babylonia to Jerusalem after the country's new Persian rulers had declared that their exile was over. Ezra's mission was, we are told, to teach God's law to the returnees, which he does by reading to them what the book calls the Torah of Moses. The idea that the beginnings of a written Bible are closely associated with the exile of the Israelites fits well with the fact that traditions are often committed to paper when the society in which they developed is undergoing extreme crises or changes. As a community living in a foreign land, the first Jews had to decide what they wanted to preserve from their past, and how to adapt to their new circumstances the culture they had brought with them to Babylonia. And given how tied their Israelite identity was to the land, to agriculture, and to the temple in Jerusalem, they had to make some serious changes if they were going to preserve their identity in the diaspora, i.e. in those countries beyond their ancestral land. But there's no way for us to know just how old their traditions about, say, the Garden of Eden were when the book of Genesis was finally written down. We do know that living in Babylonia exposed the Jews to aspects of Mesopotamian culture which did make their way into the story as we have it now. But whether they were ancient or recent, the traditions that we find in the Hebrew Bible were part of the larger world that is now known as the ancient Near East. This was a group of societies that flourished on and off between around 3000 and 600 BCE and included the following areas: the Eastern Mediterranean, which was inhabited by Canaanites, including the Israelites, who lived in the hills, and the seafaring Phoenicians who settled on the coast; Egypt, which controlled Canaan for much of the second millennium BCE; Mesopotamia, which was dominated by a series of empires called Assyrian and Babylonian that expanded into Canaan and sometimes fought Egypt for control of it; and the Hittites, who had been based in Turkey but also traded and fought with Canaan and Egypt. Though the Hittite Empire disappeared a long time before the others, during a general upheaval that struck this entire region around 1200 BCE, it was still remembered as a powerful state by the time the Hebrew Bible was composed. It was the rediscovery of Mesopotamian literature beginning in the mid-19th century which gave us a context in which to place the ideas and the culture described in the Bible. There are, for example, Babylonian parallels to the creation and flood stories found in the book of Genesis. These parallels shouldn't surprise us. Both the Canaanites and the Mesopotamians were mostly Semitic people who spoke similar languages, lived in walled independent city-states with their own kings, farmed land in a dry climate, and had powerful priesthoods who served the city's patron gods on behalf of the people. There were also cultures in which writing was a specialized skill limited to a few individuals, though there was one important difference between them. While the Mesopotamians traditionally used cuneiform, which, like hieroglyphics, was a complicated system of symbols that stood for syllables rather than letters, the Israelites adopted, sometime around 1000 BCE, the Phoenician system of letters, which is the basis of every Western alphabet today. Though the Hebrew Bible seems to have been completed by around the 4th century BCE, we know nothing about the specific individuals or groups who composed it. Unlike the Greeks, who started writing history a few centuries later, the authors of the Bible did not leave us their names, and even when they mention other books which no longer exist, they only give us their titles. The Torah in particular, which is a patchwork of many kinds of sources, gives every impression that they were edited together over a long period of time, rather than written from scratch by a single individual. Once the idea that books should have specific authors became popular among the Jews, they proposed that books like Joshua and Job had actually been written by their subjects, and that even those that did not have a main character were written by famous figures like David, in the case of the Psalms, and Solomon, in the case of Ecclesiastes. Though a few of the Hebrew Bible's books and parts of some others are written as poetry, it is mostly prose. The Torah, the word means something like teaching or instruction, contains a lot of laws which have to do with agricultural production. Most of the Israelites were farmers. With the priests who served in the temple, who had to perform many sacrifices and rituals and keep themselves and the people in a state of purity, and with the annual harvest and purification festivals. It also contains a lot of stories that try to explain the world in which its authors lived. Why is life so often a struggle? Why do people speak different languages? Who invented the tools and techniques that we know today? And how did the children of Israel become a separate nation, which, though small, is special to God? The middle section of the Tanakh is the Nevi'im, or prophets. But prophet is not a great translation of the Hebrew word Navi, in the sense that the poetic messages contained in each of these books are not predictions, but social and moral criticisms of the wealthy and powerful, and warnings directed at the political leaders of the time that their dealings with other countries would lead to disaster. We should remember that these prophecies were issued from the 8th through the 6th centuries BCE, a time before and during the destruction of the two Israelite kingdoms. A couple of the books do offer us descriptions of the future and even of the end of the world, which the prophets, living as they were at the end of their country's history, may have thought was on the horizon. Part of this middle section of the Hebrew Bible is devoted to a historical survey of the Israelites from the time they entered the land of Israel until they were exiled from it in the 6th century. A lot of this survey, which occupies the books of Joshua through Kings, might be described as historical fiction in the sense that it describes the course of events through dramatic stories about individual heroes and villains. A lot of the earlier material about Joshua's conquest of the land on the time of judges like Samson and Gideon seems to have been based on myths that had developed about the past. But it's clear that the authors also had access to specific sources about the rulers and the wars of more recent centuries. They describe in some detail, and with a certain amount of objectivity, the creation of the Israelite kingdom around 900 BCE, its split into two states, Israel and Judah, and the end of both of these states at the hands of powerful Mesopotamian empires. Then there is the final section of the Tanakh, the writings, which are an assortment of texts of different kinds: philosophy, Ecclesiastes and Job, short stories or novelettes, Ruth and Esther, poetry, the Song of Songs and the Psalms, and moral instruction, Proverbs. Just as the Hebrew Bible contains many different kinds of literature written by many different people, it also contains many different opinions about the nature and the character of God. The Torah, for example, sees sacrifice and other rituals as essential to the people's relationship with God, while the prophets often tell us that God cares nothing for offerings and wants us to do good deeds. He plays an active role in the Torah, a central one in Job, a subtle one in Samuel and Kings, and little to no role at all in Ecclesiastes, Ruth, and the book of Esther. In Genesis, God expresses regrets about having created humanity when he decides to drown them all in a flood, and he's willing to listen to Abraham's pleas for mercy for Sodom and Gomorrah, while in the book of Job, he will not allow his actions to be questioned even when they are destructive to human beings. The prophet Isaiah tells us that God's thoughts and ways are radically different from our own, and that he is responsible for the bad things that happen to us. These descriptions suggest that for the Israelites, as for other ancient peoples, God existed within our world and was the force that shaped it, what we might call natural phenomena. Let's turn now to the New Testament. Its setting in the Eastern Roman Empire of the 1st and 2nd century CE is far removed in both time and distance from the ancient Near East. This region was dominated by the Greek-speaking culture now known as Hellenistic, the result of the fusion of Greek and non-Greek elements that began with the conquests of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE. Alexander's political successors created three kingdoms ruled by Greeks and inhabited by a mixture of new immigrants, merchants, artists, and intellectuals, and the local Semitic or Asian populations. We know in the case of the Jews that those who lived in the land of Israel tended to speak Aramaic, the language of the Persian Empire that Alexander had conquered, while those like the Apostle Paul, who lived outside it, spoke Greek. That is why the first time the Hebrew Bible was translated, around the 3rd century BCE, it was rendered into Greek. Even educated diaspora Jews had trouble reading it in the original Hebrew. The empire was divided into provinces ruled by governors, and so-called client kingdoms, which were nominally independent but recognized Roman authority. The Herod of the Gospels who calls for the massacre of the innocents was one of those kings, while the one who interacts with John the Baptist did not rule Judea, which was by then a Roman province, but a small kingdom next door to it. Rome's administration of its provinces was very limited, with only a few officials and no bureaucracy at all in the modern sense. This meant that the locals were generally left to themselves. But the province of Judea, like the provinces of Britannia and Germania, tended to rebel more than the others, and was therefore saddled with Roman troops that sometimes used force to control the local populace. The New Testament, like the Old, contains several kinds of literature, though they are very different from what we find in the Hebrew Bible. The first of these is the narrative biography contained in the Gospels, which tell the story of the life of Jesus, his ministry, and his followers. But even though the Gospels are laid out chronologically, they also work in many of Jesus' sermons and parables, like the Sermon on the Mount and the story of the prodigal son. Unlike the narratives of the Hebrew Bible, they are made up of personal conversations and interactions invented by the authors, rather than the sort of objective third-party descriptions we find in modern biographies. Compare, say, the nonfiction books written in recent years about the mathematician John Nash and the physicist Robert Oppenheimer, the movies based on those books. 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are called synoptic, meaning that their content is more or less parallel and they often make use of the same source material, but they do often disagree over specific details and include entire episodes or sermons missing from the others. The 4th Gospel, John, differs quite a bit more from the first 3. Among the synoptics, Mark seems to have been the first, while Matthew might have been the only one who was actually a Jew, given his familiarity with Jewish law and practice. But we really don't know much about their authors, and it was later tradition that associated each of the Gospels with specific people mentioned elsewhere in the New Testament. Jesus and his followers were, of course, Jews who lived in Judea and concerned themselves with their Jewish brethren, and it was only after Jesus' death, beginning with the ministry of Paul in the 40s, that Gentiles living in other provinces started to turn to Christianity. Even then, the church was based in Jerusalem, and its leaders were Jews, including James, the brother of Jesus. The Gentile origin of most of the Gospels is important because it tells us that they came from a time when Christianity had stopped being an exclusively Jewish phenomenon and spread to the Gentile communities of the Eastern Mediterranean. It also explains the fact that they, and especially the Gospel of John, often cast the Jews in such a negative and stereotypical light. The letters that Paul wrote to those Gentile communities are the next major components of the New Testament. Though these letters were written to specific places and people, they also discuss larger theological issues, which suggests that Paul saw them as instructional pamphlets of a sort. Then there is the book called the Acts of the Apostles, which begins with the appearances of Jesus after his resurrection and his instructions to his followers to spread his message to the world, and goes on to tell the story of how the Apostle Paul went from persecuting the Christians of Jerusalem to joining them, and traveled with other missionaries to the Greek East and eventually to the city of Rome itself. Acts also describes the conflict between Paul and the leaders of the Jerusalem church over admitting Gentiles to the new faith without also requiring them to become observant Jews. Acts reads more like a conventional historical narrative, though it also includes conversations and speeches of the sort that are more typical of historical fiction today. Finally, there is the book of Revelation, which resembles the sort of apocalyptic visions we find in a few of the books of the Hebrew Bible, such as Daniel and Zechariah. There were many other apocalyptic books written by both Jews and Christians around that time, the most famous of which is the Book of Enoch. But while speculation about the end times has been relatively rare among Jews ever since then, the last major outbreak was in the 17th century, and has flourished among Christians for the last 500 years, and a series of self-appointed prophets have led movements in both Europe and the U.S. promising to prepare their followers for the end of the world. There has also been, for the last 50 years or so, a profitable evangelical trade in books explaining how the prophecies of Revelation are actually referring to our own times, or searching the Bible for hidden codes which are supposed to refer to the specific events of the last several decades. Though the doctrines of the various Christian churches have varied a great deal over the last 2,000 years and from one region to another, the New Testament itself has a much more consistent and unified view of the world and of God than the Hebrew Bible does, which shouldn't surprise us, as its ideology comes mostly from a single source, the letters of the Apostle Paul. While the Gospels certainly attribute to Jesus many sayings and teachings about God, human morality, and the nature of the world, these are unsystematic and open to interpretation, and each of their authors has their own ideas about what Jesus' mission was all about. In any case, the synoptics tend to describe Jesus in more or less human terms, while Paul gives him a theological role. Jesus Christ, the Son of God, whose death will save not just the Jews, but all of humanity. But either way, since Paul's teachings were already being circulated by the time the Gospels reached their final form, we needn't assume that their primary purpose was to tell Christians what they ought to believe. While the Hebrew Bible was written on parchment scrolls, as the Torah still is today, the New Testament was from the beginning written in the form of a codex, a book made of bound-together sheets of papyrus. This was a common writing material in Egypt, where it was made by gluing together strips of the reeds that grew along the Nile River, and our earliest copies of New Testament texts were dug up from the dry Egyptian sands, which preserve them remarkably well. The earliest Christian books seem to have been collections of individual Gospels, and only later, when the content of the New Testament had been standardized, were its contents gathered together into a single volume as they are now. Until then, i.e. for the first few centuries of the Church, there was a hodgepodge of texts that were accepted by some communities but not by others. When the New Testament began to take on the form it has today, most of these texts were suppressed by the Church, and the only reason we know about them now is because they were sometimes mentioned by the Church Fathers who attacked them and the people who read them as heretics, or because they were buried in the ground to protect them and rediscovered in our own times. Over the course of this series, we will examine in greater detail the history of the Bible's development from the ancient Near East through the early Middle Ages, place it in its historical and archaeological context, consider how it has been interpreted and translated over the centuries, and look at some examples of its influence on the art, literature, and popular culture of the last 2,000 years. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to your comments.